Good afternoon, everybody. We're just going to give it a minute or two to let folks join us here. One more minute, and then we'll get started. All right. Well,
Ready to
get
go?
started. So some people are still popping in, but we can kind of get started with some introductions. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Your panelists for today are myself, Matt Gaines, and I'm joined by Dylan Brown. We are both partners here in Marcus Arico, Emmer and Brooks. And today's topic is the Boston Building Emissions Reduction and Disclosure Ordinance, BRDO, more affectionately named as BERDO or BERDU. That's what we'll be talking about today. If you have any questions as we go along, I'd ask that you please use the Q&A function on your Zoom. Just type them right in. Dylan and I will be monitoring that, and we'll try to answer your questions as we go. I suspect that the materials may end up answering them, but we'll certainly keep an eye on the Q&A. One of the questions we always get is, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint slides? I'm sure I'll still get that question, but I'll answer it right now. The answer is yes. Usually within a day or a couple of days after the presentation, we email out to everybody that signed up a copy of the PowerPoint. In addition, this is being recorded, and we post the links on our website. Again, within a few days of the webinar, you can find the recording of that. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Dylan to kind of kick us off and give some background on BERDO.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So most condominium associations, especially those located in the city of Boston, are all too familiar with the term BERDO. And as Matt said, BERDO is an acronym for a local city ordinance, which stands for the Building Emissions Disclosure and Reporting Ordinance. And specifically, back in 2013, BERDO was enacted by the city of Boston under Mayor Tom Menino to specifically require large existing buildings located in the city of Boston to report their buildings' annual energy and water usage to the city's environment department each year. And the reason behind doing that, the city's environment department really wanted to get an understanding as to what buildings located within the city of Boston contribute most to the greenhouse gases polluted throughout the city. But in 2021, BERDO was actually amended to what we refer to as BERDO 2.0, which requires these large existing buildings, which include condominiums, like we'll talk about, to not only start reporting their annual energy data every year, but they also must start reducing the greenhouse gases that are emitting from those buildings in accordance with a strict emissions reduction schedule. And while this started in Boston, Boston is not only the sole municipality that has carbon emission reduction requirements. Cities and towns throughout Massachusetts over the past several years have either passed or proposed legislation that require buildings such as condominiums to do exactly what BERDO requires them to do, which is, again, report their annual energy data to the local city or town, as well as drastically reduce the building's carbon emissions in in compliance with some sort of emissions reduction schedule that's been established by that particular municipality. In addition to Boston, cities and towns that have adopted or proposed similar legislation to Bordeaux are the city of Cambridge, which has adopted legislation, and we know that Newton and the town of Concord have also proposed and have enacted similar legislation. So it's not only isolated to the city of Boston. These carbon emission reduction requirements are going statewide, and based on the trend that we're seeing, they're very likely within a number of years going to be adopted in every city and town across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And while those cities and towns may draft their ordinances differently or have their own little nuances, Bordeaux is the template. Based on what we've seen, Bordeaux is kind of the standard in which these cities and towns are going to adopt their emissions reduction requirements. So for boards and property managers, if they have a basic understanding of the mechanics of Bordeaux, that's certainly going to be tremendously, in a system in a way where they're going to be able to comply with whatever sort of ordinance that is going to be impacting their condominium in their own city or town. So we jump to the next slide, Matt.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what
Yeah.
Dylan said about how, Bordeaux is the template and how it's in other cities and towns. This presentation, while I think the title of it is sort of a Bordeaux overview. The first half that Dylan will be talking about is pretty much Boston specific, the nuances of Boston, what their requirements are. However, in the second half, when I kind of jump in, it's going to be more about condos and kind of how you respond, react. And while I suppose it's geared towards Boston, my information is probably more generally applicable to any condominium around the state. So again, the first half of this really is kind of Boston specific in terms of what's in their regs, but the second half will be more, applicable generally speaking.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. When I refer to Bordeaux as the template, whatever city or town is going to adopt something like Bordeaux, it's going to be something along these lines. But, as we'll talk about, there's going to be obligations that are similar to Bordeaux. Number one being reporting. Under Bordeaux, it could be different with respect to a deadline for a city or town, but under Bordeaux, buildings are required to report their annual energy and water usage to the city or their environment department each year. And that's going to include any sort of utility that generates power or is used within the condominium building. So that's electricity, natural gas, propane, fuel oil, or even steam. And what we found out with working with the city is that this data that needs to be reported isn't readily available on your utility bill. So it's not like the property manager can just take 1 year's worth of gas and electrical bills, submit it to the city, and check off their compliance obligations. In fact, it's a little more nuanced than that. The city and probably every, along state lines, they measure the carbon that's emitted from these buildings based on some scientific formula that I still can't really understand. I think it's kilograms of carbon per square foot, but what we do know is not on your your monthly gas or your electric bill. So what boards and property managers are going to need to do is to contact their local utility service provider, whether that be Eversource or National Grid, and ask them that they forward the requisite data that needs to be submitted. Because again, this information isn't readily available, so you're going to have to contact your service provider in order to get that, in order to produce it and comply with Bordeaux at the end of the day. Once that data is produced, the board, not every year, but during select verification years, at least with respect to Boston, they need to have that energy data verified by a third-party energy consultant or a third-party energy professional. This is, like I said, some sort of consultant who can specialize in looking at the data that was provided by the service or the utility service provider and submitted to the city. The board, during these select verification years, needs to engage this professional at the association's expense in order to conduct that verification. And then that verification is also submitted to the city. And that's an obligation under Bordeaux after the data has been collected. But most importantly, where condominiums are going to be impacted the most is that the building owners need to start drastically reducing the carbon emissions emitted from those buildings in accordance with a strict emissions reduction schedule. And Matt, if you can jump to the next slide.
Yep.
On the right hand of the slide, so that is the sliding scale that's within the Bordeaux ordinance itself. And as you can see at the top, it's broken down into 5-year increments starting in 2025. So within 5-year increments, buildings subject to BERDO are going to need to start, like I said, drastically reducing the amount of carbon that's emitted from those buildings in accordance with that scale. And if you can look along the left side, the scale is broken down based on the building's primary use. And if you look at multifamily housing, which is about halfway down the scale here, Matt, I'm not sure if you can put the cursor over multifamily housing, but right there, that's where residential condominiums are going to fall under. And as you see, again, like I said, this is measured based on carbon per square foot, but you're starting at 4.1. Again, we're no, scientific experts here, but based on us working with the city, most condominiums, but not all, especially not older buildings, they're going to be probably in compliance at the outset, but jumping from 4.1 to 2.4 is a drastic leap. And in order to start hitting those marks and hitting those emissions reduction requirements, boards are going to need to start implementing changes today and very, very quickly in order to start reducing carbon over time in compliance with BERDO. So, kind of the overall theme of some of the things that we're going to be talking about today, you got to start acting now if you're going to be start to hit these marks in compliance with BERDO or whatever your city or town's ordinance is going to be. Jump to the next slide here, Matt.
Yep.
So when do buildings need to start complying with BERDO and their emission standards? So in a residential condominium context, it's based on the number of units within the building. So if your condominium has 35 or more units, you need to start hitting your emission reduction marks starting this year. But if you fall within to a smaller association where it's at least 15 units or 34 units, then you don't need to start hitting your emission marks until the year 2030. But it's important to note if we're going back to that scale on the previous slide, it's not like they start where the year 2025 hits. So if you fall within that 15 to 34 unit, you're jumping in right where that scale starts in the year 2030. So again, taking action today is going to help your association to start meeting that sliding scale, because once these deadlines start hitting, that's where the association has to be in compliance, or else they'll be subject to fines and legal liability. What's important? Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I'm going to I'm watching the questions. Some of them we are going to answer later, which is why I'm not chiming in, but there was a good question here about,
Sure.
is the square foot measurement that we're looking at on this page based upon the outside footprint of the building or the finished wall system inside of the building? And does it include all, conditioned spaces such as heated parking garages or basements? Do you happen to? My guess is it's not the outside footprint, because as far as I understand, where they pull all the data from is from the
Right.
assessor's records. And we know that when the assessor's records decide square footage, that's, your typical, kind of walls in, what's the size of the interior size of the building, as opposed to the outside footprint. So my guess is that's the answer to the first part of the question. And whether it includes, conditioned spaces such as heating, parking garages, or basements, I don't know. You'd have to check with the city on that. That's a good question.
Yeah, I know it's touched upon in the ordinance itself. I think there's carve outs. My understanding, and again, right, don't quote me on this, the ordinance is long and nuanced, but I think if it's within that building footprint, like a parking garage underneath within and solely, kind of encompassing the building, that would be, part of
Yeah.
it, part of the square footage requirements. But again, I think it's different, and it's really different depending upon every building. So like we're going to talk about today, there's going to be nuances with your own association, and contact the city's environment department, because they might not know the little intricacies of your applicable association. So, they might be measuring a part of your building that isn't supposed to be subject or compliance to BERDO. So it's good to differentiate between the two, or at least get an answer from them.
Yeah. And if the building has less than 15 units, it's exempt unless it actually happens to be more than 20,000 square feet, right?
I believe so.
Oh, no, because that's only residential, right? Sorry. So if it's less than 15, that's exempt regardless of the size.
Right. So, and that's
Yeah.
what I was getting into. If you fall within, the 14 or less, your association is one of the smaller associations, of 14 or less units, you're technically not subject to BERDO, or a lot of these similar ordinances that we're seeing. But Bordeaux was amended, back in 2021, and the Bordeaux very well could be amended again to apply to all condominiums, or there could be statewide legislation that's enforced in order to subject, like I said, all condominiums to compliance with some sort of emissions reduction requirement. So just because you're not subject to, the emissions reduction requirements based on the scale, based on the way Bordeaux is written, doesn't mean that things can't be changed in the future.
All right.
Jump to the next slide, Matt.
Yep.
So, these are some of the ways that we're going to talk about as to how building owners can start applying with emission standards and reducing the carbon that's emitted from those buildings. Probably number one is to undertake energy efficient, building upgrades. And these can be building upgrades to your electrical system or the appliances within both the unit as well as the shared common area. It could be the HVAC equipment that's either outdated or uses a source of energy that's less energy efficient. And as we're going to talk about, making upgrades or modifications to these systems is going to drastically reduce the amount of carbon that's going to be emitted from your particular building. And what we've also learned is that if associations or any sort of building owner, subject to Bordeaux, contacts their utility service provider, a lot of them will do a free energy audit where they'll come to your property and kind of isolate areas of need as to, and make suggestions as you should be changing these systems, or you should be switching out and using, high efficiency electric lighting. And a lot of these service providers will conduct a portion of the work for free, or not at the expense of the association. And, the benefit to doing that and the theory behind it is that you make these sort of changes now, and your energy savings that you're going to save in the future are going to offset the costs that you ultimately made in order to make these modifications to the building. So that's one of them. Another way that you can comply with Bordeaux is either purchasing the rights to renewable energy in the form of an energy renewable certificate, or otherwise, kind of tapping into a renewable energy source offsite, or the building or the association could generate renewable energy on site, either through a power purchase agreement or the installation of their own systems. Perfect example of that, and what a lot of condominiums, especially in Boston, could be ended up doing is installing solar panels on the roof. A company might lease those solar panels to the association for a certain period of time, or the association can install them on their own. But nonetheless, you're going to be generating renewable energy source on site through the use of solar and the solar panels, which will offset, the carbon emitted from that building at the end of the day. Another kind of, it's particular to Boston, what Bordeaux allows building owners to do is to tender what's called an alternative compliance payment. And the city's pretty clear that it's not a tax, it's not a fine, it's not a penalty, but you're making a payment that is then going to be invested into some decarbonization project in the city of Boston, or funding some sort of decarbonization program within the city of Boston. And the theory behind it is that by making a payment into this sort of fund, you're aiding in the decarbonization throughout the city, and you should be able to use this in a combination of a lot of these options. So it could be that, you're making some sort of alternative compliance payment to reduce, the impact that your building's having, but then you're also budgeting to upgrade the systems within your unit, and you're also installing solar on site, or you're purchasing renewable energy certificates. So a combination of these things can ensure that your association is going to be in compliance with Bordeaux, or at least you're doing your best in order to do so. Jump to the next slide, Matt. There's also flexibility measures that Bordeaux offers that they're not, particularly prevalent to a condominium association, but you can use a blended emission standard. Some associations are pretty split between them being commercial and residential. So what you can opt and have the city to do is to basically have you subject to two different compliance schedules. So if we went back to that graph, multifamily housing is where residential condominiums are going to be. So you can opt to have your residential portion be subject to that, and then the commercial portion of your building be subject to the commercial board standards. So they're each a different sliding scale. So the commercial isn't offsetting the residential and vice versa. So you could be subject to two in order to kind of better fit your needs for your particular building. You can also use building portfolios portfolio standards. So you would have one emissions reduction schedule for your entire building portfolio. It's pretty prevalent for landlords or real estate investors who have a ton of different properties across the city or your town. And you would just be subject to one emissions reduction schedule. So that way you can budget and plan accordingly as to, when you're going to make building upgrades or purchase renewable energy certificates, things like that. Individual compliance schedules, city allows you to kind of take advantage of modifications or upgrades that you made in the past. So Berto starts tracking this back in 2021 as to when you were supposed to start making improvements in order to meet your carbon emission reduction requirements. So by adopting into an individual compliance schedule, you can take advantage of things that you've done in the past. So if you upgraded your heating system previous as to when the city started tracking you, you might be able to take advantage of what that offset was carbon wise. But obviously you're going to need to be able to produce documentation and everything else to the city to show that, look, these are the changes that we've made and this is the impact that it's had. So if you're able to prove that and show the city, you could be, have that offset on that sliding scale at the end of the day. And then there's hardship compliance plans. You can request that you just be subject to a different emissions reduction schedule or delay things a little bit, either based on a technical hardship or a financial hardship. Perfect example is an association who simply doesn't have the budget to make these sort of upgrades right now, but they could 10 or 15 years from now. And the city could give you this sort of alternative compliance payment, or sorry, not alternative compliance payment, but a hardship compliance plan. It's kind of like getting a variance where you're not subject to the sliding scale right now, but what's clear is that by 2050, when you're supposed to be at carbon neutral status, you still got to meet those marks. So it allows you to kind of not be subject to penalties along the way, but the goal at the end of the day is still the same. You can jump to the next slide, Matt. So now we're going to really dive into, how can condominiums comply with BERTA, which is, the basis of our discussion today. So
Yeah, and just to repeat kind of what I said at the beginning, in case folks were joining late, everything that Dylan has sort of set up to this point is really specific to the Boston Energy reporting disclosure. However, what we're going to talk about from here on out, while I'd say it's maybe slanted toward Boston, because that's frankly the ordinance that Dylan and I have the most familiarity with. What we're going to talk about now really could apply probably to ordinances that may be adopted. We know of ones in Cambridge, Newton, and Concord. And also a bunch of people have been commenting in the chat, and I was curious to see if we were going to get these comments. A lot of people have said, oh, I received a notice recently for an association in Rockland. I received one for a place in Salisbury, that for 20,000 square feet property or more. So I just became aware of this myself, I think a couple of days ago, where a client of mine got a notice and they're in Canton. So we are aware that there was a state law passed, I think a couple of years ago, but it actually, while it's passed a couple of years ago, it just goes into effect in 2025. And I admittedly don't know all of the mechanics of it, but it does appear to have some similarities with BERDO, at least with respect to reporting, in that now really anywhere you are in the state, the reporting obligations appear to apply to buildings over 20,000 square feet. As far as, what the emission standards are and some of the stuff Dylan talked about with Boston, I don't know what those are yet for the statewide, because again, this is so new and we haven't had a chance to really dive into it yet. But again, some of the things that we're going to talk about next would apply probably to anywhere in the state, not just Boston.
Yeah, I mean, I think that brings up a good point, right? Whether it's BERDO or this, statewide legislation, the obligations are really the same. Report your data and cut the carbon emitted from your building. The end goal and the obligations are going to be the same. How you get there could differ from city or town, but like we're going to talk about here, here's some of the things that you can start to implement in order to get the results that you need. So ultimately, who's responsible for compliance with BERDO? Data reporting, third-party verification, emission reduction requirements are responsible for what the ordinance defines as the building owner. And in the condominium context, the ordinance of Berto specifically identifies the condominium association, the condominium trust, or the board of trustees as the building owner. So that means the association at the end of the day is ultimately the entity that's responsible for reporting, verification, and reducing the building's carbon emissions. There are some little nuances like a tiered condominium association, what we refer to as master and sub associations. Kind of the short of it is you have one large umbrella of association with smaller associations underneath it. It's more prevalent in Boston or larger cities as opposed to the suburbs, but a hotel's a good example of it. You have one large association with a residential portion of the condominium. Then you have a hotel portion of the condominium, and then a parking garage portion of the condominium. In those situations, sometimes it's difficult to identify as to who the building owner is or who's the reporting obligations, who do those fall under? And as Matt said, the city kind of by default refers to the tax assessor database is to, who the responsible building owner is. So that might not add up as to how your condominium is currently constructed. So in those situations, contact the city, contact the environment department as to determine who's responsible for your reporting and your verification and your compliance at the end of the day. But what's clear is that neither unit owners or tenants are responsible for compliance with BERDO. And that's because the board reports aggregate building data that they get from the service provider. That's the data that's submitted to the city. So compliance with BERDO is measured based on the results that are generated from the building as a whole, as opposed to the individual units. So unit owners aren't submitting their own data, neither are their tenants. The board's getting, aggregate data from their service provider and submitting that. So it's not able to measure as to, units 1 through 2 are in compliance, but 3 and 4 are not in compliance. And that's why it's crucial that all residents start taking initiative and taking the action that the association deems necessary to comply with BERDO or any sort of state ordinance. But while boards can designate the reporting and the third party verification to the property manager, again, the association is the entity that is subject to compliance with BERDO at the end of the day. So the property manager won't be, levied fines or subject to liability for failing to report or failure to verify. That again falls on the association at the end of the day. So that means that the association is going to need to cut and reduce the greenhouse gases that are emitted from both the individual units as well as the shared common area. Because again, the carbon reduced is measured based on what's reduced from the building as a whole. So that means, like I said, just one non-compliant owner or of a group of non-compliant owners who just subject the entire association to non-compliance when a majority of the unit owners are doing their jobs and making the necessary changes. Just a couple of those bad actors can, ruin the plan for everybody. But what we found is that success with BERDO or a similar ordinance is undoubtedly going to require major upgrades and modifications to your building's components and fixtures. That could be your electrical systems, your heating and air conditioning equipment, your appliances, both in the unit as well as the common area, and even exterior portions of the building or the roof. So we've developed kind of a checklist for boards and property managers to go through if they're going to need to be making these sort of modifications. So they got to ask themselves 3 questions. Is the project in the unit or the common area? Does that project constitute a repair or improvement? And who's ultimately responsible at the end of the day for undertaking the work? Jump slides there, Matt. So, a lot of this is going to be basic Condo 101, but it's really important for understanding for emissions reduction requirements. So all components of the condominium are they fall into one of 3 categories. It's either part of the unit, the common area, or the limited common area and facilities. And it's important to make that determination because responsibility or assigning responsibility as to who's responsible for undertaking that work depends upon where that work is going to be taking place. So in order to make that determination, boards and property managers, they got to review and become familiar with their governing documents. Again, a lot of this is kind of basic that everyone understands, but we'll run through it quickly. The master deed subjects the condominium land to the provisions of the Massachusetts Condominium Act, but more importantly, it defines the physical boundaries of the unit and distinguishes as to what's the owner's property, the individual unit owner's property, as opposed to the shared common area, which would be the association's property. the declaration of trust and the bylaws. They create the association, and they determine how the Board of Trustees governs the association, and rules and regulations, place restrictions, and govern the use of common area. Jump to the next slide, Matt. So basic examples of this, as a general rule, any component of the condominium that's located outside the boundaries of the unit as defined in your master deed is going to be considered the common area. And the master deed, again, is going to define what constitutes the individual unit. So typical unit examples for BERDO or emissions reduction purposes are appliances that are contained within and serve a unit exclusively. So that could be an oven or a stove that's wholly contained within the unit, as well as a washer and a dryer, if that particular association allows that within their units. So those individual appliances, if they're located within and serve their unit exclusively, chances are that your governing documents are going to find that particular appliance as solely part of the unit. And that's important because you might have to make an upgrade to your oven or a stove and convert it to electricity in order to start reducing carbon emissions. Or same thing for gas, converting a gas washer and a dryer to an electric one will start reducing the numbers that you need. Same thing goes for heating systems. A lot of furnaces or boilers in an older building could be running on oil or natural gas. Again, converting that to something that's high efficient electricity is going to start reducing the numbers to a point where you need to be. On the flip side, typical common area examples with respect to BERDO, and again, every condominium document is drafted differently. So you got to take a deep dive into what your particular provisions provide. But here's, these are some of the examples that we see. Windows could be entirely, located outside of the boundaries of the unit and the association's responsibility. Same thing goes for the exterior of the building and the roof. This comes into play for BERDO purposes such as insulation, right? If you're generating heat or AC within the unit and it's leaking out the windows or it's leaking through the building exterior, obviously you're going to be using more energy than you reasonably should be. So if you're able to seal that up, insulate it properly, your building's going to operate more efficiently and as a result produce less carbon. Probably more importantly, we talked about the appliances located above. So while those individual appliances such as a stove, a washer, a dryer, that could be considered part of the unit under your documents, but those appliances have a series of pipes and wires and other equipment that could be located outside the boundaries of the unit or serve, multiple units within that same building. And your documents very well could say that appliance is the unit, but the series of pipes and wires and other equipment is common area. So your documents could very well say that the owner needs to replace the stove, but the association needs to replace the equipment that goes along with it. And you could assign responsibility that way.
All right. Thank you, Dylan. So as Dylan talked about, obviously, and most of you probably know, your typical condominium, you've got the units and you got the common area, but there's also what are commonly referred to as exclusive use or limited common area. These might be, or these are areas of the part of the common areas, but they're reserved or designated for a specific unit. They typically are decks, patios, porches, balconies, things like that. For the most part, upgrading these aren't really going to play into BERDO, right? Like if you put on the condition of your deck or a new deck or a patio isn't generally affecting the energy efficiency of the building. However, there is one, typical limited common area that we did want to touch on, which does relate to BERDO, and that's HVAC systems or air conditioning condensers. Those are obviously usually, particularly the condensers, located outside of the building. They could be on the roof. Sometimes they're attached right to the side. If you walk through, the South End or Back Bay of Boston, you'll see that, or sometimes they're just located on the ground. So technically they're outside of the unit, therefore they're not part of the unit. Some documents describe that they are, but for the most part, they're not. And they're designated as exclusive use of the owner, and therefore they're usually the owner's responsibility to maintain. And so certainly that is an item that might need to be upgraded in order to help your emissions reductions. So assuming that there is some type of item, now we're talking common element that needs to be replaced or upgraded, and it's a common element in order to, again, try to reduce your emissions, the next analysis that you do, so again, Dylan talked about the first analysis, is it part of the unit or part of the common element? let's assume for the moment that it's part of the common element. The next analysis that you need to do is this the work that needs to be done a repair or an improvement? A repair, as it states right here in the slide, and this is taken out of, frankly, this language is almost taken directly out of some court cases, is when you substitute damaged, excuse me, or worn out parts with new material. It doesn't have to be a like for like replacement all the time, but basically, again, you're taking something that's old and worn out and disrepair, and you're putting something new in place of it. That is a repair. An improvement under the condominium statute, while not defined at all in the statute, again, has sort of loosely been defined over the years by some court cases. And that's when you're adding, new features, elements, or facilities to the condominium that did not previously exist. The reason why this is important is how do the decisions get made? Who gets to decide, are we moving forward with this, upgrade, this replacement? Well, the short answer is that under most condominium documents, if it is a repair, then the board can make that decision. The board can decide without a vote of the owners that, hey, we are going to repair or replace this common element and just proceed accordingly. If, however, the item is an improvement, so again, looking at the definition above, adding a new element, feature, or facility, and I'll give some examples on the next slide. But if the item is an improvement, well, now that falls under the condominium statute 183A section 18, which says that you actually do need a vote of the owners in order to go forward with improvements. And specifically, you need 75% of the owners, at least 75% of the owners, based upon beneficial interest, to vote in favor of the improvement, in which case the cost would be assessed to all owners. There's a little bit of a nuance or quirk in the statute, frankly, that says that if more than 50%, but less than 75, so 50 to 74% of the owners vote for it, then only those people who voted for it have to pay for it. That seems wildly unfair, but that's what the law says. And then finally, if less than 50%, vote in favor, then the improvement cannot go forward. So some examples kind of these two categories, particularly as it relates to BERDO here in any energy, clean energy law, are repairs. So again, in some associations, the windows are actually part of the common area. They're not part of the unit. So if you wanted to go around and replace all the windows to make the building, more energy efficient, that would just be a repair, right? The building already has windows, so you're not adding any new feature or amenity. You're just replacing the windows, even if they're new, fancy, nice windows, that's still just a repair. And simply, substituting, an old window for a new superior product is not an improvement. In addition, repairing any, cracks in the building's facade or gaps in the building envelope that might, help with the heating system to be more efficient. Again, those are not improvements. Those would be repairs. So the board can proceed with that without a vote of the owners. Examples of improvements, I threw the first two, swimming pool and tennis courts, obviously have nothing to do with BERDO. I just put them in there because they're an easy example for people to understand about what is an improvement, right? Clearly, if you're adding a swimming pool or a tennis court, that is a new feature or amenity, and that is an improvement requiring a vote of the owners. Other examples that might be more common for a BERDO situation would be if you're adding solar panels to the association, you're installing electric vehicle charging stations, and you were converting your heating system, maybe it's an old boiler, oil burner system, and you're making electrical. That's really a change because you're fundamentally altering the type of the system from, oil to electrical.
And Matt, just look at some of the questions here, basic, when it comes down to repairs versus improvement, unless it's an improvement and they're making some sort of change or upgrade, it's going to default to a repair, right? Whether that's an alteration or a repair. So it's based on the provisions of what your documents say as to how you're assigning responsibility at the end of the day as to who's going to be responsible for making that upgrade or modification.
Then the next question, again, so you kind of on your step 3 of your analysis is like, all right, we've determined that it's a repair or an improvement, whatever it is, to the common elements. How the heck are we going to pay for this? And so, there's a few options here. You can obviously, if it's not that much, you could dip into your operating account. If it's a little bit more and you have a healthy reserve account, you can certainly use reserve funds, assuming it's some type of capital, repair, which usually they would be in this situation. Obviously, if those aren't available, there's other options. You could do, special or supplemental assessments where the board, again, without a vote of the owners, can typically, levy a special or supplemental assessment to the owners. Sometimes those are done in one lump sum and say, hey, everybody, has to pay $1,000 in the next 30 days or 60 days. Or sometimes, frankly, if it's a bigger amount, it might be spread out over the course of, several months or even a year that, hey, for the next 12 months, everybody has to pay an extra, 300 or 500 or even more, obviously could be the case. So, that's an option to do assessments. The other option as well, which some people may not be aware of, is condominium loans. Yes, condominium associations can actually go to a bank. There's quite a few banks now that do it, mostly local banks, where the association actually gives a loan to a bank. The interest rates are, typical rates that anyone else would get. And the advantage of that, obviously, is it allows you to spread the payments out over a longer period of time. Sometimes the repayments under these loans are anywhere from, 5, 7, 10 years tend to be typical. I've even seen some though that are 15 or 30 years for, really big, projects. We've had some associations that do, entire building envelope projects where they're residing all the buildings, they're putting the roof on, and, these could be, $3, $4, $5 million or more projects. Obviously, that's a lot for the owners that pay. So, the association goes out and gets that loan. And, then the owners, pay it back over, in a very extended period of time. Again, it could be 5, 7 years, and they just pay it, through their regular monthly condo fee or sometimes as a supplemental fee. As I note in the bottom point, or before I actually get to that, so you have a couple of options, right? You dip into your reserve account, you do a supplemental assessment, or you do a loan. What I see most often is usually a hybrid of 2 or 3 of those, where you might say, okay, we've got a healthy reserve account. We don't want to completely deplete it. So we'll pull, 300,000 out of reserve, and then we'll go get a loan for another 200,000. Or, we'll do a special assessment for 100,000 and we'll get a loan for 200,000 or whatever it is, right? You can kind of figure out what works best for your association. I think most people know this, but with respect to any, special or supplemental assessments, those, if they're not paid by the owner, they are lien on the unit, just like, regular monthly condo fees. So what do you do if an owner's not complying? For example, again, maybe the upgrades that need to be made are actually more in the unit. The individual units have their own heating systems or just other equipment in the unit that needs to be upgraded. How do you force an owner to upgrade their equipment? And the short answer is it's not easy. You first look at your documents and see if there's anything you can hang your hat on to really try to get the owners to do it. Most documents have a provision that require, very broadly unit owners to comply with all laws, regulations, statutes, ordinance, etc. And I would argue that obviously if it's a condo in Boston, we're talking about Berto here, if you have that provision in your documents, Berto obviously is a regulation and ordinance, and therefore, owners are subject to it and must comply. So if an owner refuses, you could say, well, you're sort of indirectly in violation of the condo docs because you are not following Berto, and therefore, we can pursue a violation against you, whether it be fines or other action. Frankly, the better step to do would be to actually have, a very specific provision in your documents that says that unit owners must comply with, Berto or whatever the ordinance might be in your city or town. And so obviously to do that, though, you'd have to amend your documents, which typically, involves a supermajority of owners, either 65 or 75% vote of the owners. But it just would give you a little bit better of an argument if you're trying to enforce this, where you can point to a very specific provision as opposed to kind of that catch-all provision I mentioned. Again, if the owners, regardless if you have the specific provision or the more general one, if they fail to comply, typically under the documents, the board has a right of access to an owner. an owner's unit to maybe even perform the work for them, you have to send the owners notices first, that when given them opportunity to do that. You could even go into court to get a court order forcing the owner to comply. Obviously, that can be very expensive. There is an argument that the legal fees to do that could be assessed back to the owners, but of course, it's never a guarantee. You know, judges sometimes will ding us on those things. But there are options available, but it's not always an easy avenue to get these owners to comply. As folks know, with any issue with owners, it's not ever easy to get them to comply.
And Matt, that brings up a great point. You know, BERDO or whatever ordinance that could be statewide it's relatively new, right? So there's no case law on this. You know, the courts really haven't even decided as to, you know, what would happen if the board sought enforcement of a BERDO regulation and a unit owner challenged it. You know, we think that the documents, if they're specific, is a great argument for the board in order to enforce that. But at the end of the day, it's all this is new. It could be unclear at the end of the day as to how a judge would rule in that particular issue.
Yep.
That's like any litigation, though.
Yeah, so just to kind of some sort of best practices and key takeaways, and then we can flip to some of the questions here. Is again, you know, review your documents, determine if whether or not the system or the component that needs to be upgraded or modified is part of the unit or part of the common area or exclusive use area, but it's likely either going to be unit or common area. If it's part of the unit, obviously the board should make a demand upon the owner to make that necessary upgrade. If it's part of the common area, which is likely going to be the case, the next analysis is, you know, whether or not this is a repair and improvement. And if it's a repair, the board can do the work without a vote of the owners. If it's an improvement, the owners do need to vote on that. And just a couple other kind of takeaways here in terms of if you're considering amending your documents to sort of add some language mandating BERDO compliance. Again, just review your documents to figure out the percentage of the owners needed to amend. Draft the amendment. I suggest you work with your attorneys to do that. You know, send out the notice and the ballots and everything to the owners to get them to vote in favor of that. Just some other kind of resources and reminders. The city of Boston has a very good website about BERDO and all things BERDO related. I would note that probably the best resource, and I don't say this just because we were involved, but is the the birding reporting how-to guide. We actually were engaged by the city, Marcus Cervico, Emma Brooks, to draft a how-to guide. And so what is on their website is actually, you know, a more comprehensive explanation than this, you know, 1 hour PowerPoint that we gave today, but we did have our hand in kind of drafting that, and it is available on the city's website. Some additional resources, and again, this will be emailed out to you, so you'll have all of these resources available to you. I think there's technically links here, but I'm not sure you can click on them obviously on the screen now. But if you need any of these links, please let us know. We can certainly get them to you. Again, the best website for BERDO is just go to boston.gov/BERDO. You can get a lot of the information you need there.
And one of those links is going to be a link to a list of third-party professionals or energy consultants that have actually responded to the city's request for proposals, so they can do third-party verification. It's a whole list. You know, I think it's over 100 consultants that could perform that work. And while they're responding to the city of Boston's, you know, request for proposals, presumably they could do that statewide, right? You know, it's not narrowly tailored to just Boston. So any local city or town should be able to contact them.
So yeah, let me flip over to some of the questions.
Sure.
This question's a good one. I'm not sure I know the answer. Maybe you do, Dylan. Does BERDO qualify for the new state benchmarking requirements, or is there something additional that will be required? Do you have?
That I don't know. Maybe that's talking about the new legislation.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's talking about the new legislation that is statewide. In which case, I don't know how well, because I haven't read it in detail, to be honest, how well that dovetails with BERDO. But I know that cities can be more restrictive generally than state laws. So, you know, I would suggest that for now you stick with the BERDO if you're in Boston. Is there a definition of what is an energy professional? Do professional engineering firms qualify, or is there a separate specific qualification? I think this question.
I don't know if there's specific standards that they need to meet. I know they need to be in the industry. right? So what they're doing is verifying the data that the board submits to the city at the end of the day. Um, I don't know if there's kind of a checklist that the fire department goes through to verify whether they're a professional. What we've seen is energy consultants are the perfect, professional in order to gauge Berto or for an association to engage for this, because not only can they verify, emissions data that's being submitted, but they can also, make recommendations as to, what high efficiency upgrades that you need to make within the building. But I guess to answer the question, is there a checklist that they need to adhere to? I'm not sure. But obviously before you go and engage the contractor, if it's in doubt, I would just contact the city to determine that, saying, look, we're going to engage these guys to verify our results. Just want to make sure they're qualified enough.
Does purchasing the ACPs, which is the alternative compliance payments, offset against your condo's compliance needs? I believe so, right?
It does, yeah. So the way that, like Matt said, we were working with the city, the ACP payments, they're not a tax or a fine, but it's a way that the association can comply with Berto. The theory behind it is you should use a combination of everything, right? If you're going to be updating your heating systems, obviously that's going to take a lot of budgeting and years of planning, but if you're an association with 35 and more units, your deadlines are 2025. So maybe it's making a compliance payment for at least a portion of that time period until you make the upgrades. But to answer the question, yeah, they count towards your compliance towards the emission scale. I think it's based on the kilograms of carbon per square foot is, X amount of dollars. And then if, you meet your mark by paying that amount, you'll be in compliance.
What is the criteria for you to determine whether or not you need to complete a compliance schedule?
So it's based on building use,
Right.
right? I think if I'm understanding the schedule or the question correctly. So that emissions reduction schedule provides a timeline as to when you have to start reducing, and then that timeline is based on your building use. So if you're a completely residential condominium, you're going to fall into the multifamily category. If you're a wholly commercial condominium, you're going to fall into the commercial side of it. But if you're broken down based on a number of different uses, kind of in that, master condominium that we were talking about, residential, commercial, hotel, whatever it may be, my understanding is that by default, the city's going to subject you to what your primary use is. But you can also opt into one of those flexibility measures where you can be subject to a bunch of different uses based on the amount of uses that are within your building.
There was a question asking if any cities and towns in New Hampshire that I know of are requiring such. Unfortunately, I don't practice at all in New Hampshire. You could check with either Gary Daddario or Justin Magzarilli in our office. They both work it up in our New Hampshire office, and they might be able to help you out with that.
It wouldn't surprise me. It's nationwide,
Yeah,
California,
it's
New
definitely
York.
becoming more and more
Yeah.
popular. If the utilities report the information directly to Berto, why do we need a third party to verify? Do you know?
My understanding is that the board can ask the service provider to report it directly to the city, but it's still being submitted on behalf of the association. So I think it's to just check, their results and verify that what was submitted was accurate. But it's a valid question, right? If you're going right to the source, why does the city make you spend the money to engage an energy consultant? Like I talked about earlier, I guess the only benefit to doing that is that they can do more than just verifying your results at the end of the day.
What happens with solar when there is no common meter, just owner meter, i.e. townhouses? So there, I guess that you would put the solar on each of the townhouses and connect it to their individual meters. I think is the answer to that. So then they would lower their energy data.
And then that would still be factored into the data that's submitted at the end of the day, because it's aggregate building data, which would account for the units. We might not be able to decipher that unit one was cut due to solar, but the results should be the same, right? If a bunch of people adopt solar, that number should theoretically go down at the end of the day.
All right. What's the legal difference between an assessment or a fee? If you're asking in the condo context, nothing. I mean, they're all just terms of art. Condo fees, condo assessments, those terms are used interchangeably. If you're asking with respect to the city, I'm not sure, but in the condo context, the terms are used interchangeably. The building code defines a repair differently than yours, stating changing the fuel source for an HVAC system, i.e. converting from natural gas to electric, would likely not be considered a repair under the building code, but rather would be an alteration. I think I agree with that. Maybe I misstated something, but again, if you're a repair is sort of replacing something that's there, but if you were to be converting your heating source from fuel to electric, and so you're really rehabbing the entirety of the heating system in the building, I agree that would be an improvement, not a repair.
And maybe they're referring to, assigning responsibility, which we kind of talked about, right? If it's anything other than an improvement, you can assign that responsibility accordingly. You don't need unit owner consent to conduct a repair. But if it's an
Yep.
improvement or alteration like you're talking about, you need unit owner consent.
This kind of a follow-up question to the one that was just asked about solar. Can individual unit owners install solar panels on a common or HOA-owned roof? So that's a great question. And it's kind of a hot topic right now in that, I would argue no, because the roof is a common element, and therefore the owners would need the board's permission. There is a statute that dates all the way back to 1988, believe it, which was probably when solar was first invented, which states that there can be no restrictions in any type of covenant or documents. So that would include condo docs, HOA docs, whatever, that unreasonably restrict solar panels from being installed. So, I suppose the answer is that the board can't necessarily prohibit it, but maybe they could put some restrictions on it. There is a bill that is currently pending in the legislature in Massachusetts here that just got filed that would add a little bit more meat and teeth to that legislation from the 80s. So who knows if that's going to pass or not, but so there could be some changes on that.
I saw a good question in here, Matt. It's come up a few times. The logical, response to this is convert your appliances, your systems to high efficiency electricity. But, what if there's not enough electricity within the streets or the city or towns? What is, the city or the municipality going to be doing about that? And I think it's a really valid question. I'm not sure if we currently have the capacity for every single building within the city of Boston, for example, to tap into electric, right? So if that's the case and the building can't hook up in the way that it wants to or it's budgeted to, I think it's a legitimate issue to raise, and you should be able to adopt into one of those alternative compliance payments or not compliance schedules where you can say, look, we budgeted for this, we're ready to go, we just can't hook in because the infrastructure is not there, so we shouldn't be subject to that, and we should be able to seek an extension as to when we're supposed to comply. I think it's a perfectly legitimate argument.
Someone asked if there's any exemptions for historic buildings, maybe in Beacon Hill. Do you know? I don't think so.
I don't know if there's a specific exemption to it, but again, kind of like I just said, it's a great argument to raise. So look, we've conducted a free energy audit, and our windows are super old and they're not energy efficient, but we can't change those windows due to historical limitations. So, I think that's a great argument to raise to say, we shouldn't be subject to at least a portion of this, or we should be able to extend down the line in order for us to be able to catch up and do some things that will make us comply.
Next question is specific to the condominium statute. It's a good question, actually. This person asked, doesn't section 10B6 of the Condominium Act make energy saving devices count as a repair versus improvement? I'm not sure how widely that would apply. So it's a good question, because actually that section of the statute was just amended about 3 months ago. It still doesn't make it a repair, because again, repairs can be decided solely upon votes of the board, no vote of the owner is required. However, yes, in the condominium statute, there is language that states that if you are making certain energy saving changes, you're putting in low flow shower heads, or you want to separately meter units, whatever, it actually said it's not an improvement, and it's yet, I guess, a third category in which case it still requires a vote of the owners, but it's only a majority of the owners, not 75%. And it's actually even less technically because it's only a majority of those owners present at a meeting. So again, for the improvement, it's 75% of all owners. For these energy, upgrades under the condominium statute, it's a majority vote, but not a majority of all owners, only those present at a meeting. So, easy math, if, 80% of the owners happen to show up at the meeting, then you would only need, half of that number to vote in favor of it, which would be, 41% of all owners as opposed to 50% of all owners. When are Berto fines and penalties expected to start being issued?
So we've been, dealing with a lot of associations who received that initial violation letter, but, I don't know if you've heard differently, Matt. I haven't had an association who's actually been levied a fine by the city
No, I have not
yet.
either,
And
yeah.
us working with the city, I think it was a learning experience for both of us, right? We taught them, the intricacies of the condominium structure, and they taught us, why and how Berto was implemented. So I think everybody's, coming to the understanding that, look, these are requirements, but a lot of people need some time to catch up in order to, budget and plan accordingly. So from what we've seen, nobody's actually been issued or levied a fine, but the ability to do so is written in the ordinance.
Question about, I'll take about maybe two more questions here, a little after 1 o'clock. We try to keep these to an hour. What about a gas boiler system that needs to be replaced anyway, but the board chooses to convert to electric instead of replacing it with gas again? Isn't that a repair? I think, again, the problem here with repairs and improvements is that there is no black and white definition in the statute. There are some court cases over the years that have helped to guide us a little bit. I think this is somewhat of a gray area.
Yeah.
So, I suggest you consult with your attorney and see what they tell you. Do nonprofits get any breaks or concessions? I don't know because we typically deal with the condo world. Do you have any idea on that?
I don't.
Yeah.
Perfect question to ask.
Yeah,
for
definitely gotta check with the city. And I think Dylan mentioned at the beginning, but the folks from at the city and their environmental department that are kind of overseeing this are extremely knowledgeable and they're here to help. They told us that. So we're not here to make this more difficult, even though people may think that, we're here to kind of help you out and hold your hand and walk you through it if you have questions. So, definitely don't hesitate to reach out to them. Maybe we'll take one more question here. How do you address with the unit owners that like the unit hotter than normal in the winter or colder in the summer? For example, some people like to have a window open for fresh air and have the heat on. Is the response change if the heating and cooling is a common expense versus a unit owner expense? I mean, I think that's a tricky situation, particularly you have these old buildings, with these old radiators. Particularly, in Boston, you got buildings that date back to the 1800s. And inevitably you have some units that are, burning up and some that are cold. I remember I used to live in an apartment in Brookline, when I was in law school, and my bedroom was 1,000 degrees during the winter. And so I frequently had a window and a fan open, obviously extremely inefficient. But, that's why the building needs to make these changes, right? Because they were just burning heat unnecessarily. And that's one of the things that they could look at is how do you make this building more efficient?
And I think that also is a good point to, finish it off here, Matt, is that it's really difficult to isolate the bad actors under Berto,
Yeah.
right? You report building data as a whole. You're not reporting individual unit data. So it's really difficult to say that unit 6 and 12 crank up the heat during the winter where everybody else is being reasonable about it. There's really not a mechanism for the board that's currently in place to, identify those bad actors and seek enforcement accordingly. It's really difficult to do so. So that's why it's best to be really specific as to what your documents say, and adopting a Berto specific provision will certainly help.
All right. Well, I think that's it. We kept it to just over an hour, which is usually our goal. And again, if you signed up, you will receive a copy of this presentation in the PowerPoint as well. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Dylan or whoever your attorney might be in the office. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.